The parking lot at Cedar Creek Medical was still dark when Katie Morrison pulled in at 0515, her sedan settling into a spot near the emergency entrance. The October air carried that peculiar San Antonio humidity, thick enough to taste, the kind that made prosthetics sweat underneath scrubs. She sat for exactly 42 seconds, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing the way she'd been trained. In through the nose. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth. The same rhythm she'd used in Kandahar when the mortars started falling. Her left leg ached. Not the prosthetic, the phantom pain below the knee, the ghost of the limb that had been shredded by shrapnel 3 years ago. The custom titanium prosthetic from Walter Reed was military grade, the kind of engineering that cost more than her car, but it couldn't eliminate the memory of what had been there. Pain was information. That's what the combat medic had told her during recovery, back when she'd still answered to Captain Katie Morrison and had an actual rank that meant something. Now she was just Katie. Just a nurse. Just someone who climbed stairs a little slow and never complained about the night shifts. She unfolded herself from the driver's seat with practiced efficiency, one hand on the door frame, feeling the titanium engage as her weight shifted. The prosthetic was hidden, custom sheath mold to her calf, covered by compression sleeves that blended with skin tone, invisible under any standard scrub pant. Nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew. Nobody needed to know. Disappearing had been her skill set long before the extraction in Kandahar went sideways and the Pentagon lawyers scrubbed her records clean. The hospital corridor at 0530 was almost empty, just the skeleton crew and the machines that never slept. Katie moved through the fluorescent-lit hallways with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days, since the day she'd been discharged from Walter Reed with a new face, a new name, and a classified file that said Captain Katie Morrison officially no longer existed. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read Catherine Morrison, RN, in white lettering. Nobody asked about the middle name. Nobody asked about anything. The cardiac intensive care unit sat on the 4th floor, and Katie took the stairs instead of the elevator. The elevator was faster. She took the stairs because it hurt, because pain meant she was still here, still real, still tethered to something concrete. The handrail was cold under her palm as she climbed, her right leg doing most of the work, the prosthetic leg moving with mechanical precision, smooth, even, never trembling. At the top of the flight, a younger nurse named Sarah was heading in the opposite direction, coffee in hand, and she paused. "Hey, you okay? That's the 3rd time this week I've seen you limping up the stairs." Sarah's voice carried genuine concern, the kind of thing that Katie had learned to deflect without lying directly. "Old soccer injury," Katie said, and kept moving. Flares up in the humidity. It wasn't a lie. It was exactly the kind of partial truth that had kept her alive for 36 months. Soccer injury. Like everyone had one. Like it was normal. Sarah nodded and didn't press, which meant she'd believed the half-truth, which meant Katie had done her job. She was invisible. She was forgettable. She was exactly what she was supposed to be. The ICU opened up before her, 12 beds, 10 monitors beeping their constant electronic lullaby, and the particular smell of a cardiac unit at pre-dawn, antiseptic cutting through the ghost of someone's overnight coffee, the metallic tang of blood work from the night drawers, and underneath it all, something that smelled like hope thinning out. The night shift nurses were just starting their handoff reports, and Katie moved through the space like water, quiet and efficient. She checked the 4 lines on Bay 7, a post-MI patient doing better than expected. She adjusted the cap mask on Bay 4. She reviewed the morning lab's printout and made notes in a color-coded system that only made sense to her. At 0545, Dr. Pierce arrived. She heard him before she saw him, his shoes, Italian leather, clicking against the linoleum with the kind of rhythm that announced importance. He carried his coffee in a thermos that probably cost more than Katie's monthly rent, and he was already scowling at something on his tablet before he actually entered the unit. He watched her for 17 seconds. Katie knew this because she'd learned to count silently during tense moments, a habit from the days when timing meant the difference between living and becoming a statistic in someone else's report. She felt his eyes on her as she climbed the step stool to check the 4 line at Bay 6, her movements deliberate and controlled. The step stool required balance. The titanium required concentration. Neither showed on her face. Taking the stairs again, Morrison. Pierce's voice had that particular tone doctors sometimes used, not quite a question, more like an observation designed to sting. More efficient, Katie replied without turning around. Her hands continued their work, checking the line for air bubbles, adjusting the flow rate to 150 milliliters per hour. Fourth floor cardiology ward needs the elevator more than I do. She didn't say, my prosthetic leg requires physical conditioning. She didn't say, the pain reminds me I'm still alive. She didn't say anything that would make him look twice. Invisibility was technique. Pierce made a small sound, something between a laugh and a grunt of dismissal, and moved toward the nursing station. Katie heard him shuffling papers, heard him say something to one of the residents about someone's medication reconciliation being a mess, heard the particular sound of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered enough to actually push back. At 0600 sharp, the Admiral arrived. The announcement came through the intercom first, incoming cardiac case, ETA 6 minutes, and then the controlled chaos began. Cedar Creek Medical wasn't a trauma center, but they had a cardiac program, and the Admiral's case had been flagged as critical enough to warrant a direct admission to the ICU. Katie was checking supplies in Bay 2 when they wheeled him in on the stretcher, an elderly man, military-bearing even in his obvious distress, his skin that particular grey-white color that meant his heart had worked against him and lost the first round. Admiral James Brennan. That name came through on the transfer paperwork, printed in bold, flagged with military status. His chart showed a massive anterior wall myocardial infarction, ejection fraction dropped to 30%, and a cardiologist in Austin who'd called ahead to say, "This man needs your interventional suite. He needs your best." The anesthesiologist arrived with him. Captain Marcus Holloway, the name badge read Captain, though Katie heard someone in the unit call him Breaker, which meant he probably had stories that matched hers, though the handshake they exchanged was brief and professional and contained nothing that could be read as recognition. He was a compact man, early 50s, with eyes that had seen things and knew the weight of silence. He was scanning the unit with the particular attention of someone who'd worked in places where details meant survival. Katie moved to Bay 1, where they were settling the Admiral, and began the pre-admission protocol. Cardiac monitor leads. For access. Blood draw for labs. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from 3 years of intentional invisibility, but as she inserted the angiocath needle for the 4/14 gauge, one smooth motion, no fumbling, she caught Holloway watching her hands. Not her face. Her hands. His eyes tracked her technique, the way she'd angled the needle, the specific depth of penetration, the angle of the catheter seat. The pause was so brief that nobody else in the room would have noticed, but Katie felt it like a pressure change. He was looking at her hands and seeing something more than a standard ICU for insertion. O2 sat dropping, one of the residents called out, pointing at the monitor. Brennan's oxygen saturation was trending downward, 88% now, heading toward dangerous territory. Non-rebreather, Katie said, already moving. High flow. She fitted the mask over the Admiral's face with the economy of motion that came from having done this in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled hospital room. Combat zones didn't have time for hesitation. This hospital didn't need to know that, but her hands remembered. Holloway was still watching. His eyes had moved from her hands to the inside of her left wrist, where her scrub sleeve had ridden up slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of a surgical scar, thin, precise, and very old. The kind of scar you got when a surgical team had to work fast to save what was left. The moment lasted 2 seconds. Then he looked away, which meant he'd either recognized something or decided not to pursue whatever he'd almost thought he'd seen. Katie didn't let her breathing change. She didn't let her hand tremble. She simply continued working, checking the oxygen flow, watching the monitors, being exactly what everyone expected, a competent ICU nurse moving through her morning protocol with professional calm. The Admiral's oxygen saturation climbed. 92%. 95%. Stable. By 0630, Brennan was settled in his bed, medicated with sedatives that brought his agitation down, and the cardiology attending had scheduled an emergency catheterization for 0900 hours. The interventional suite was being prepped. 2 cardiologists were being called in. The hospital was moving at the controlled speed of people who knew this was serious but believed they had time. Katie restocked her for supplies, saline flushes, dressing changes, the specific sterile instruments that would be needed for the next 12 hours. As she worked, Pierce passed her on his way to speak with the attending, and he handed her a requisition form marked with red ink. "This supply request is excessive," he said without stopping. "Restock levels are fine. We don't need this level of inventory." Katie took the form. The items listed were standard post-surgical stock for the cardiac unit, 14-gauge catheters, dressing supplies, saline, a specific suture kit for emergency access repairs. Nothing excessive. Nothing unusual. Everything she'd requested based on standard protocols. "Yes, doctor," she said quietly, and set the form aside. Holloway was watching again from across the unit, his attention seemingly on the Admiral's monitor but his peripheral vision tracking the interaction. His jaw tightened slightly, barely visible, but visible. Katie moved on, checking the crash cart supplies, verifying medication doses in the digital system, doing the 10,000 small things that kept an ICU running. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. Her breathing never changed. But underneath the compression sleeve on her left arm, underneath the carefully hidden prosthetic, underneath 3 years of invisibility and reinvention, something inside her had recognized something in Admiral Brennan's eyes when he'd looked at her during the fore insertion, before the oxygen mask went on, before the sedatives took hold. Recognition. Not of her face, but of something else. The kind of recognition that only came when one person who'd survived the impossible met another person who'd been trained to do the same. What she didn't know yet was that Admiral Brennan had never forgotten the captain who'd shielded him during that Phi-base inspection in Kandahar when the IED detonated. What she didn't know was that he'd been searching for her for 3 years. What she didn't know was that the moment he'd seen her hands during that fore insertion, he'd known exactly who she was. And what happened next, what was about to happen in the next 48 hours, would change everything. Dr. Pierce stood at the head of the conference table during grand rounds, holding Katie's supply requisition form like evidence at trial. 30 assembled staff members watched as he lifted the paper higher, his voice carrying the practiced condescension of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "This is what happens when we hire nurses who can't follow basic protocols," he announced, letting the form flutter slightly before setting it down. Every single item flagged for unnecessary expenditure. Yet these are standard post-surgical stock for the cardiac unit. Standard. Which means either Nurse Morrison doesn't understand our guidelines, or she simply doesn't care to follow them. Katie sat 3 chairs down from Pierce, her jaw tightening imperceptibly, the only visible sign she'd heard him. She continued reviewing her patient chart, one hand resting on the table, steady as surgical steel. Her eyes didn't lift. Her breathing didn't change. Around her, several residents exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of the newer nurses, fresh out of school, looked genuinely confused, as if she expected Katie to defend herself, to speak, to react in some way that would confirm her humanity. Katie gave her nothing. She turned a page in her chart and kept reading, her composure an absolute wall. Pierce droned on for another 3 minutes about competent standards and attention to detail, about the importance of fiscal responsibility, about how shortcuts in thinking led to shortcuts in care. His voice had the measured quality of someone performing righteousness for an audience. Katie had seen this before, in different uniforms, in different languages, in different deserts. The bullying of someone perceived as weak by someone convinced of his own superiority. The difference was that in Kandahar, when men like Pierce spoke that way, people died. Here, they just got humiliated and moved on. After rounds concluded, Katie walked to the 3rd-floor vending machine. The hallway was empty except for a surgical resident named Marcus who'd been in Katie's unit twice this month. He leaned against the wall near the machine, watching her approach with the casual predatory attention of someone who'd identified an easy target. Marcus was 28, quick-witted in the way that residents could afford to be when they had institutional backing and a medical school diploma hanging on their wall. Katie inserted her dollar bill. The machine hummed. She selected black coffee, no cream. Maybe stick to bedpans, Morrison, Marker said, loud enough for the nurses stationed 30 feet away to hear. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that bounced off the institutional walls. That's where you're actually useful. That's your lane. Katie's face revealed nothing. No flush of embarrassment. No tightening around the eyes. No sharp intake of breath. She collected her coffee from the dispensing slot, the cup warm against her palm. She added 1 sugar with deliberate, unhurried movements. The sugar packet crinkled as she tore it open. The spoon clinked once against the ceramic as she stirred. Then she turned and walked away without a word, her composure like a sealed vault. Her left leg was more pronounced when she was tired, the slight limp a ghost of old injuries, and today she'd been awake since 0500. But she didn't shuffle or favor it apologetically. She walked like someone who'd made peace with her own wreckage. Marcus's laughter died when she didn't respond. He'd expected anger, or tears, or at least acknowledgement. Silence was worse for him than any comeback could have been. By Thursday, Dr. Pierce had escalated his strategy with the precision of a man who understood institutional power. Katie learned about the first call to security through the grapevine, one of the younger nurses mentioning it casually over lunch that Pierce had spoken to the charge officer about potential policy violations. By the second call, it was no longer casual gossip. It was a campaign. She was in the cardiac ICU, checking Admiral Brennan's vitals at 1,430 hours, when Pierce appeared in the doorway with a security guard. The Admiral was sleeping, his oxygen saturation stable at 96%, his heart rate holding steady at 62 beats per minute. His cardiac function was improving steadily, his prognosis brightening by the hour. Katie didn't look up from the monitor as Pierce began speaking to the guard, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure she heard every word. "We may need to escort Nurse Morrison out if she continues these protocol violations," Pierce said, gesturing vaguely in her direction. "I'm not comfortable with her access to patient records. Not comfortable with her unsupervised care of high-acuity patients." The supply requisition incident was just the most recent example of a pattern of concerning judgment. Katie continued checking the Admiral's full line. She adjusted the infusion rate by 0.2 milliliters. She verified the cardiac rhythm on the monitor, sinus rhythm, steady and true. Her hands moved with the smooth certainty of someone performing a task they could execute in their sleep. She didn't acknowledge Pierce's presence. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even look at him. The security guard, an older man named Holloway who'd worked at Cedar Creek for 15 years, studied Pierce's face for a long moment. Then he studied Katie's profile as she worked. Something in that exchange, something in the contrast between Pierce's manufactured certainty and Katie's absolute calm, seemed to register with him. He nodded once, non-committally, and left without committing to anything. That afternoon, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Chen assisted Katie during a routine cardiac catheterization for Admiral Brennan. Chen was a former combat medic, transferred from another hospital 6 months ago, and he moved with the economical grace of someone who'd trained in field medicine before he'd ever seen the inside of an operating room. Katie had observed him in 2 previous procedures, efficient, respectful, attentive to details that junior staff often missed. The kind of person who understood that in medical crises, like in combat, lives hinged on the quality of your team. As Katie's hands moved during the catheterization, her movements precise, her suturing technique exact and efficient, Chen went absolutely still. His eyes narrowed. He watched her hands for 10 full seconds, tracking the specific pattern of her sutures, the particular economy of motion, the way her fingers held tension and release like someone who'd practiced on living tissue under impossible conditions. The suture pattern wasn't wrong. It was just distinctive. Military. Specific to a particular training lineage. Chen leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, meant for Katie's ears only. "I've seen that suture pattern before, Helmand Province. 2011. Katie's hands didn't pause. Her fingers continued their work with mechanical precision, her breathing unchanged. But her eyes lifted for one moment and met his directly. In that exchange, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, an entire conversation occurred. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The silent agreement that some doors, once opened, needed to close immediately. Katie said nothing. Chen nodded slightly and stepped back, continuing the procedure in silence. He'd volunteered information. He'd confirmed suspicion. And now he would ask no further questions and speak to no one about what he'd seen. That was the code among people who'd operated in zones where identities shifted like sand and names were luxuries reserved for people who didn't need to disappear. The catheterization concluded successfully. Admiral Brennan's coronary artery showed significant stenosis in the left anterior descending, but the procedure had restored adequate blood flow. His oxygen saturation climbed to 98%. His EKG normalized. He was stable, recovering, improving. Katie cleaned her hands in the scrub sink, her movements methodical and thorough. She was still adjusting her gloves when Chen passed behind her. "Thank you for your discretion, Doctor," she said quietly. He didn't stop walking. "Thank you for your service, Captain." But that stability, that improvement, that careful equilibrium Katie had maintained for 3 years, all of it was about to collapse. The Admiral's cardiac system was stronger than anyone realized. Dr. Pierce's fear about what she might eventually discover was becoming desperate and urgent. And somewhere in the night shift ahead, a crisis was waiting that would force Katie to make a choice that no amount of composure could protect her from. 2140 hours. The cardiac ICU alarm system screamed like wounded animals waking up all at once. Admiral Brennan's monitor sang a song of disaster, his rhythm fragmenting, blood pressure collapsing in real time as if someone had pulled a plug from his chest. 87, 82, 76. The numbers fell like stones down a well. Katie was there in 4 strides. The night shift was skeleton crew, 2 residents she'd never worked with, both somewhere between competent and terrified, both watching her the way people watch someone who knows what they're doing. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she moved, her hands already calling for the crash cart, already reading the monitor as if it were written in her native language. Sinus rhythm had abandoned Admiral Brennan's heart. What remained was chaos. Electrical storm. Ventricular fibrillation that made the green line on the monitor look like a seismograph recording an earthquake. 200 joules, Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a question. Not a request. One of the residents, Rodriguez, the name tag said, moved to the defibrillator. His hands shook slightly, the kind of tremor that came from adrenaline and doubt in equal measure. He charged the paddles. Katie already had the EKG leads off, chest exposed. She placed the paddles with the precision of someone who'd done this in the dark with rounds whistling past her head, in Phi base shank at 0300 hours while the Taliban tested the wire. The resident with the nameplate reading Chen held the light steady. That one had seen something in her movements. That one recognized the signature of training that didn't come from bedside manner courses. "Clear," Katie said. She pressed down. Brennan's body convulsed once, twice, the involuntary response of electricity rewriting the heart's electrical system. The monitor flatlined for one terrible breath. Then rhythm returned. Not normal. Not good. But rhythm. Sinus at 98, then 110, climbing toward unstable tachycardia. "Get me Dr. Pierce on the line," Katie said to Rodriguez without looking away from the Admiral's chest. "I'll try the emergency line," Rodriguez stammered. He was already moving toward the phone mounted on the wall, his fingers fumbling through the hospital directory. Katie opened a second 4 line with movements that required no thought, no conscious decision. Muscle memory was just another word for training so deep it lived in bone. The catheter slid into the Admiral's arm like a key into a lock, and she was already pushing medications, epinephrine first, 1 milligram in a syringe that glinted under the fluorescent lights like a tiny weapon. Adrenaline for a failing heart. The oldest drug in the resuscitation playbook, and the most honest one. Got him, Rodriguez said into the phone. His voice cracked slightly. Dr. Pierce, the Admiral's in VFib. Captain Morrison wants you in here immediately. Yes, sir. He said. Rodriguez's face went pale. He lowered the phone. He says to call it. He says it's been 40 minutes, he's not coming in, and we should start postmortem care. Katie didn't stop moving. Her hands continued their work as though the words had been spoken in a language she didn't understand. Epinephrine needed 3 minutes to work. The monitor showed improvement, the rhythm stabilizing into something less chaotic, though still dangerously fast, dangerously unstable. She was already calculating what would happen if she followed protocol. If she waited for the morning team. If she accepted Dr. Pierce's assessment that this was a death, not a crisis, not a patient worth pulling the morning shift out of bed for. Tell him the Admiral's responding to medications, Katie said to Rodriguez. Tell him I want a cardiologist in here in 5 minutes or I'm taking this to administration. It wasn't a bluff. But it was a test, and somewhere in her chest, in the part of her that had made decisions under fire, she already knew what the answer would be. Rodriguez relayed the message. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 3 seconds. Then Dr. Pierce's voice came through the speaker, cold, sharp, the kind of voice that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed. Tell Morrison she's out of her scope. She's a nurse. Nurses follow orders. Call it. Wait for the morning team. And tell her there will be consequences for this insubordination. The line went dead. Chen's hands trembled. Rodriguez looked at Katie as if she'd suddenly transformed into something he couldn't quite categorize. The Admiral's heart was still fighting. Still trying. Still alive in the way that mattered, each beat a negotiation between chemistry and electricity, between what the body wanted and what physics demanded. Katie crossed to her locker in the corner of the ICU break room. It took 12 seconds. The combination was muscle memory too, the 14th of July, 32, the birthday of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Sergeant who died pulling her out of the rubble in Kandahar. The locker swung open. Her work shoes, her extra scrubs, and underneath it all, the surgical kit she'd never officially had. Combat shears. Retractors. Forceps. A scalpel that had been field sharpened 1,000 times. The faded unit patch from 3/5 Marines was still sewn inside her jacket lining, the one hanging on the hook above everything else. She pulled the surgical kit free, its weight familiar in her hands like the memory of an old language. She didn't allow herself to think about what came next. Thinking was how people froze. Thinking was how people failed. Rodriguez, Chen, I need you, Katie said, already moving back toward Brennan's room. Rodriguez, you get on the phone to the OR. Tell them we're coming down and they need to have an open thoracotomy tray standing by. Tell them it's Admiral Brennan and it's not a request. Chen, you're with me. I need hands on lights and suctioning. But Pierce said, Rodriguez started. Pierce is wrong, Katie said. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd issued commands in a language where hesitation meant death. Admiral Brennan is not dead. His heart is still fighting. And I know how to make it keep fighting. Are you with me? Chen was already moving. He understood something in Katie's posture, in the way she'd said fighting. He understood that what was about to happen existed in the space between protocol and necessity, and he made the choice. Rodriguez made it a half-second later, reaching for the OR line as Katie carried her surgical kit back into the ICU where Admiral James Brennan's heart continued its frantic, desperate rhythm. The Admiral's chest was already exposed. Katie was already prepping the skin with antiseptic that smelled like copper and medicine, that sharp, clinical smell that meant boundaries were being crossed. The left anterolateral thoracotomy would require going between the ribs, between the muscles, into the space where the lungs and heart lived. The space where decisions became permanent. Hold the lights here, Katie told Chen, positioning him on the right side of the bed. Higher. I need to see the chest wall anatomy. Do not move. She took a breath. The last conscious breath she'd take before training took over completely. Then her hands moved as if someone else was operating them, as if the part of her that had performed this same procedure in Phi Base Shank at 0300 under IED-starved light had simply taken control of the present moment. The scalpel made its first incision with a sound like fabric tearing. The skin parted. Blood rose up immediately, and Chen was already suctioning, already keeping the field clear, his hands steady because Katie's hands were steady, and steadiness was contagious. Fourth intercostal space. The anatomical landmarks were the same whether you were in a field hospital or an ICU. The ribs, the muscles between them, the external intercostals, the internal intercostals, all the layers that protected the heart from the world. All the things that had to be cut through to save a life that refused to die. Pain was information. Pain was data. The Admiral couldn't feel this, sedation and the electrical storm in his chest had already removed him from sensation. But his body understood what was happening. His blood pressure was responding, his heart rate was responding, the oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal range as the crisis became something she could touch, could see, could fix with her hands instead of just watching it happen on a monitor. The ribs spread. The pericardium opened. And there it was, the organ itself. The muscle that had pumped blood through a Navy officer's body for 67 years, that had survived combat and command and the weight of decisions that killed other men. It was failing. It was also still trying. Katie's hands moved through the thoracotomy with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this in the dark, in the noise, in the certainty that if she didn't succeed, 17 Marines under her command would die. She found the left anterior descending artery, the culprit, and began direct cardiac massage, her fingers working the muscle back toward rhythm as Chen kept the field clear and Rodriguez's voice came through the room telephone confirming that the OR was standing by, that the hospital was responding to her authority as though she had the rank to give it. The rhythm stabilized. Sinus rhythm returned. 104 beats per minute, then 98, then 86. The Admiral's blood pressure rose from 72 to 90 to 112. Oxygen saturation climbed to 94%. It was done. The crisis was done. What came after would be administration and policy and consequences. But for this moment, for these 37 seconds where her hands had been the difference between another day and a grave, Admiral James Brennan was alive because a captain nobody was supposed to know about had remembered exactly how to keep him that way. "Get me a temporary pacing wire," Katie said quietly. "We're moving him to the OR. Chen, you stay with him. Call the attending cardiologist at home if you have to. Tell them to meet us in the OR. Rodriguez, document everything you saw. Not for Pierce. For the record." Rodriguez nodded. His hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed, now that he could afford to process what he'd just witnessed. Chen was already following the stretcher, already moving with the Admiral toward the operating suite. Katie stood there for one breath, her hand still covered in blood, her surgical kit already being set down on a nearby tray. The night shift nurse, the quiet one nobody paid attention to, had just performed a procedure that existed in classified military manuals and combat medicine textbooks, not in Cedar Creek Medical's protocols. The consequences of that choice were already coming, already moving toward her like weather that couldn't be outrun. But the Admiral was alive. That was the only metric that mattered. Dr. Pierce arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 0557 hours, his Mercedes still running in the administrator's parking space as he strode through the sliding doors with his phone already pressed to his ear. He'd spent the night making calls, 7 of them, each precisely calibrated. The hospital board chairman first, then the chief medical officer, then 3 department heads. By the time the sun crested the San Antonio skyline, Dr. Pierce had repositioned the surgical schedule, eliminated the 2 residents who'd assisted in the unauthorized thoracotomy by reassigning them to different hospitals across the state, and secured verbal commitments from 3 senior physicians to corroborate whatever account of events he needed them to confirm. The night shift nurses watched him stride past their station without acknowledgement. He moved with the confidence of a man whose power was institutional and therefore invisible, the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice. By 06:30 hours, Administrator Diane Vasquez stood in the Chief Medical Officer's office reviewing the documentation Dr. Pierce had prepared. Charts. Emails. A detailed account of unsafe practices and deviation from established protocols. He drafted it flawlessly, every sentence calibrated to describe exactly what Katie had done while reframing the motivation from life-saving to reckless ambition. This nurse performed a thoracotomy in an ICU setting without attending physician authorization, Pierce explained, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone presenting facts rather than an agenda. The Admiral survived. That's fortunate. But procedure is procedure. If we allow field surgeries to happen because outcomes are positive, we've eliminated the entire foundation of hospital hierarchy. Vasquez nodded slowly. She'd been an administrator for 19 years and recognized the logic, even if something in Pierce's delivery felt practiced. Like a performance that had been rehearsed. The first thing they did was restrict Katie's access badge. By 06:45 hours, IT had flagged her credentials as inactive pending investigation. She would not be able to swipe into any hospital unit, any medication cabinet, any locked supply room. She would not be able to access her employee file or review any of the documentation they were building against her. The isolation was clean and clinical, no scene, no confrontation, just a technical barrier that made her presence at Cedar Creek Medical impossible without explicit written permission from administration. This was how institutions removed people. Not with anger, but with process. Katie arrived for her shift at 0700 hours without knowing. She always arrived early, always had. The habit from military service ran too deep to break. She swiped her badge at the main entrance. The door didn't unlock. She tried again. The scanner beeped red. A security guard approached her, young, uncomfortable, reading from a script on his phone. I'm going to need you to step back. Your credentials have been flagged pending investigation. You can't enter the building. She didn't ask why. She didn't demand answers. She simply nodded, turned, and walked back to her car. The parking lot was half empty at this hour, the morning sun already brutal and bright off the concrete. A early shift ER tech she recognized walked past her, then stopped, confused. Morrison? Aren't you going in? Katie kept walking. Composure was her armor and her prison in equal measure. By 0800 hours, the formal termination was official. A letter arrived by courier to her address in North San Antonio, a modest two-bedroom rental where she'd lived for 3 years under the name Catherine Morrison, RN. Effective immediately, your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated for violation of hospital policy, unauthorized use of surgical equipment, and deviation from established clinical protocols. The letter was signed by Administrator Vasquez and co-signed by Dr. Pierce. At the bottom, one additional line, your RN license has been referred to the Texas Medical Board for review pending investigation. The two residents who'd held the lights during the thoracotomy received emails at 0815 hours. Both had been reassigned, effective immediately. One was being transferred to a hospital in Houston, 3 hours south. The other was heading to Austin, 2 hours north. Their rotations, their mentorships, their standing at Cedar Creek Medical, all dissolved in the time it took to send an email. Dr. Pierce had made calls to both hospitals before their reassignments were official. A quiet word here, a favor there. The residents would arrive at their new assignments understanding without being told that their future careers depended on their silence about what they'd witnessed in the ICU. Katie sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 40 minutes after receiving the termination letter. She didn't cry. She didn't make phone calls. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and understood the architecture of what had been done to her. The patient had survived. That part was unambiguous. Admiral Brennan's heart was beating, his organs functioning, his prognosis moving from dire to hopeful. The procedure had been necessary. It had been successful. None of that mattered against the weight of institutional protocol, against a doctor with board connections and legal knowledge and the confidence of a man who'd been committing fraud for 18 months and knew how to hide his tracks. He'd spent the night not investigating the truth but constructing a narrative. And narratives, Katie understood from military training, were far more durable than facts. She drove east on I-37, toward the older part of San Antonio, toward the kind of place where a woman in scrubs and a hospital ID badge wouldn't draw attention at 3 a.m. The 24-hour diner was called Stella's, and the red vinyl booths had probably been installed sometime in the 1980s. The fluorescent lights hummed with the particular frequency of institutional fixtures. She'd heard that same hum in every military barracks, every field hospital, every waiting room where she'd sat watching other people's lives unfold while hers remained suspended. She ordered coffee. Black. She didn't drink it. The waitress was maybe 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from working the graveyard shift for longer than she wanted to think about. "Long day, hun?" the woman asked, refilling the coffee cup that Katie hadn't touched. Katie shook her head without looking up. The waitress moved on to a truck driver 3 booths down, a man with a CB radio voice and a calendar dog on his seat cover. She left Katie alone. This was the gift of 3 a.m. diners. They asked no questions because they understood that people who sat in them at this hour had reasons for sitting that went beyond hunger. Katie's reflection stared back at her from the dark window. Hollow-eyed. Still in scrubs because she hadn't gone home to change. Her jacket draped over the booth beside her, the one with the unit patch sewn inside the lining, faded and worn, invisible to everyone except her. She touched her legs through the fabric of her scrub pants, feeling the prosthetics beneath. The synthetic material was warm from body heat, responsive to pressure, engineered well enough to fool most people into thinking she was whole. The phantom pain had started up again, the kind that doctors said was impossible, pain from limbs that no longer existed, and it was strange how vivid it was, how real, compared to emotions she could no longer access. 3 years ago, she'd been ordered to vanish. The extraction had gone sideways in Kandahar, in a sector near the German Phi base in Kunduz province. An IED detonated during what should have been a routine inspection of a new FOB location. She'd been there unofficially, attached to Admiral Brennan's security detail in a capacity that couldn't be documented. When the explosion came, she'd made a choice that took her legs but left the Admiral intact, and 17 enlisted personnel alive who would have died in the secondary blast. The Pentagon gave her the Navy Cross in a closed room with 3 witnesses and told her it could never be mentioned in public. They gave her prosthetics and a medical discharge and a new identity and told her to become someone else. Catherine Morrison, not Captain Morrison. A nurse, not a soldier. A person without a past. She'd gotten used to it. That was the strangest part. The disappearing hadn't felt like a loss after a while, it had felt like a default state. A woman who took orders from doctors who didn't respect her, who accepted humiliation without response, who carried her old identity in a patch sewn into her jacket lining like a ghost. Who asked no questions and expected no recognition because recognition would have exposed what she was hiding. She'd learned to live inside the invisibility so thoroughly that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The clock on the diner wall read 0323 hours. 3 hours and 23 minutes into the worst day of her post-military life. Except it didn't feel like the worst day. It felt like every other day, the same powerlessness, the same inability to fight back, the same requirement to absorb punishment and keep moving. She'd survived firefights and IEDs and amputations. She could survive this. The logic was sound. The logic was also a lie. The waitress came by again. "Can I get you anything else, hun? Pie? Eggs?" Katie shook her head and pulled out a $20 bill from her scrub pocket, left it on the table for a $6 check, and slid out of the booth. She moved with the careful precision of someone whose legs were a technology rather than a body part, each step calibrated, controlled, the kind of motion that took concentration and never quite looked natural. The waitress watched her go without comment. At 3 a.m. in a San Antonio diner, you learned not to ask questions. You let people disappear the way they needed to. She walked out into the pre-dawn darkness and understood that she'd been disappearing her entire life. The military had just given it a name and a uniform and a mission. Everything else was just the same skill applied to different circumstances. She could disappear again. Vanish from Texas, assume another identity, find another hospital in another city. She'd done it before. She was good at it. She was, in fact, excellent at it. The question that kept her standing in the parking lot for another minute was whether she had any choice left, or if choice had been an illusion all along and she'd just been following coordinates that someone else had set. Her phone buzzed at 03 for 7 hours. A text from an unknown number, Admiral Brennan asking for you. Cedar Creek Medical. Don't answer this number. Destroy this phone. She stared at the message for 15 seconds, then deleted it. Then deleted the thread. Then powered off the phone. She stood in the pre-dawn cold with a dead phone in her hand and a $20 bill on a diner table and a medical license under investigation and no hospital that would hire her and 48 hours of free fall ahead of her, and she made the only choice she'd ever really made. She waited to see what would happen next. 48 hours of silence. That's what Katie didn't expect, not the termination, not the investigation, not the certainty that her second life was collapsing exactly like her first one had. She'd made peace with disappearing. It was the reappearing that terrified her. The call came at 0634 hours. Not to her phone. To Cedar Creek Medical's main line, and the hospital operator transferred it upstairs to administration because the voice on the other end said Pentagon and the word carries weight, even in Texas. Katie was in a 24-hour fitness center 3 miles away, running on a treadmill with no destination, when her phone, the burner phone she'd activated 6 hours earlier, buzzed with a message from a blocked number, returned to Cedar Creek immediately. Admiral Brennan has asked for you by name. She didn't run faster. She didn't feel hope. She felt the weight of a decision point, the way a soldier feels when a command comes from someone above the chain of command entirely. She changed into her scrubs, drove back to the hospital, and walked through the same corridors where Dr. Pierce had publicly dismantled her 12 hours ago. The administrator was waiting at the ICU entrance. His face was pale. "Captain," he said quietly, and Katie realized they all knew now. Every person in the hospital knew exactly what she was, and everything she had been trying not to be. Admiral Brennan's eyes opened as she entered the room. Not the groggy, half-conscious stare of a man emerging from sedation. Full focus. Sharp. The eyes of someone who had just woken from a nightmare and knew exactly which world was real. He looked directly at Katie, his breathing steady despite the ventilator, his hand reaching toward hers with the careful deliberation of a man testing his own mobility. When she moved closer, when she took his hand and felt it squeeze with surprising strength, he whispered a single word with absolute clarity, "Valkyrie." The day nurse stared in confusion. Valkyrie wasn't medical terminology. It wasn't anything in his chart. It was the call sign. It was the name that only existed in classified files, in the Pentagon sealed records, in the part of history that the United States military preferred to keep vertical, standing upright in secret, never horizontal on a page. The nurse looked at the hospital administrator standing in the doorway, and the administrator's face had gone the color of someone watching a building he trusted suddenly collapse from internal damage he never knew existed. Within the hour, a Marine colonel arrived at the hospital with a folder marked with official seals. He walked into Admiral Brennan's room with the kind of posture that makes the air pressure change, and he positioned himself at the foot of the bed where Katie stood. He opened the folder slowly. Deliberately. The way you open something that has weight. He read aloud, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, "Captain Katie Morrison, United States Navy, received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces in Kandahar Province, August 14, 2019, when she shielded a flag officer from an IED detonation, sustaining traumatic amputations of both lower extremities and preserving the lives of 17 enlisted personnel in her direct command. Decorations withheld from public record pending national security review. As of this date, all classifications have been lifted. Captain Morrison's service record is now open." Dr. Pierce burst through the door in that moment, because someone had called him, some residual instinct making him think he could still control the narrative if he arrived fast enough. He saw the colonel in dress blues. He saw the folder. He saw Katie standing there, and for the first time, he saw her for exactly what she was. His mouth opened, then closed. He was trying to calculate his angle, searching the room for a way to reframe this into something manageable, and he found none. A two-star general walked in behind the colonel. Not walked, arrived. His presence made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, made the room feel smaller. He rendered a full salute to Katie, not a casual gesture, not a perfunctory motion, but a textbook military salute executed with the kind of precision that means respect. His fist touched his chest. Held. Released. The kind of salute you give to someone who has earned it in ways most people will never understand. Dr. Pierce watched this salute, and Katie saw the exact moment he understood that the game he'd been playing, the calculations, the removals of witnesses, the deletion of records, had all been orchestrated inside a building he didn't actually own or control. "You're done here," the general said to Dr. Pierce. Not a threat. A statement. The difference is critical. Pierce left. He didn't argue. He didn't call his lawyer yet. He walked out because something in that general's tone made it clear that arguing would only accelerate what was already inevitable. Hospital security had been moving for hours. At the Pentagon's request, they'd pulled server access logs going back 18 months. They were looking for any threats to Katie during her employment, anything that might have put her in danger, anything that might have been retaliation. What they found instead was Dr. Pierce entering the server room at 0237 hours, 2 hours after Katie's termination. The timestamp glowed on the security monitor like evidence written in light. The IT director, a Marine veteran named Rodriguez who'd served in 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines before his discharge, watched the footage with the administrator. Pierce at the terminals. Fingers moving. Mouse clicks. His face showing the kind of focus you see in people erasing their own crimes. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. He pulled up the backup protocols, something Pierce apparently didn't know existed. Everything was there. Patient billing records. Surgical schedules. Katie's employment documentation. All copied. All preserved. Rodriguez had implemented those backups 3 years ago, after an incident with corrupted files. He'd set them to run automatically, 3 separate drives in 3 separate locations, and he'd kept the redundancy quiet because it was smart IT work. Now it was something else. Now it was evidence. Rodriguez made 3 calls. Hospital administration. The FBI field office in San Antonio. His old platoon sergeant working at the VA. "We have a problem," he said, and he explained it in the clipped, efficient language of someone who'd learned to communicate under pressure. By noon, FBI agents were in the hospital administrator's office with a warrant. By 1400, they were in Dr. Pierce's office with boxes. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators who've already identified their prey. Dr. Pierce sat in the conference room under fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed designed to expose every deception. The agents laid out 18 months of phantom billing codes. Equipment charges inflated by 40 to 60%. Offshore account transfers totaling $1.37 million moved through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Monaco. The agents had his emails too. The ones to board members. The fabricated evidence against Katie. The systematic removal of residents who might have testified to her competence. "I want my lawyer," Pierce said, his voice cracking, and Katie heard later that it was the first moment he'd shown any emotion at all, and it wasn't remorse, it was fear. "You'll need one," the lead agent replied. The Pentagon liaison reviewed the timeline. Accessed Katie's file. Cross-referenced the dates Pierce started targeting her with the dates he'd begun his phantom billing scheme. He was covering fraud, the liaison said quietly. She was too competent. Too detail-oriented. She would have noticed the discrepancies in equipment orders, in billing codes, in the surgical schedules that didn't match the procedures. He needed her gone before she found out. By evening, Dr. Pierce was arrested. His medical license suspended pending investigation. The local news had the story by 2100, prominent cardiac surgeon charged with federal fraud, 18 months of theft, framing of decorated combat veteran. The networks picked it up by morning. Katie didn't watch the news. She sat in a hotel room across town, her phone buzzing with calls from hospital administration, from the Pentagon, from reporters who somehow had her number. She didn't answer any of them. She was still in that moment 48 hours earlier, standing in the diner at 3 a.m., watching her reflection in the window, deciding if she wanted to exist again. Someone had apparently made that decision for her. 6 months later, Katie Morrison walked through North San Antonio wearing her Navy dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. The captain's insignia sat on her shoulders like something that had always belonged there, like recognition that had finally caught up with reality. Through the window of a community college building, she could see a classroom. Inside it, Dr. Pierce taught a CPR certification course for minimum wage, his hands moving across a training mannequin with mechanical efficiency, his face older than she remembered. His medical license was gone. His name was attached to a federal fraud case that had made national news. Insurance companies had sued him. Patients from 3 years back were filing settlements. The offshore accounts had been seized. The elegant life he'd constructed from other people's suffering had collapsed like a structure built on nothing. He looked up when she passed the window. His eyes met hers for exactly 1 second. Then Katie kept walking, her prosthetic legs steady beneath the dress uniform, her pace even and purposeful. She didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge him. The time for that kind of thing was past. Her new office was at the VA hospital downtown, a position created specifically for her skill set. Director of Emergency Medicine. A title that meant resources, authority, and the ability to protect the people coming through those doors. On her office wall hung the faded unit patch from Kandahar, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining all these years, hidden even from herself. Next to it, a photograph from the Pentagon ceremony where Admiral Brennan, recovered and returned to limited duty, had pinned her delayed Silver Star. And below both, her Navy Cross citation finally declassified, finally visible, finally real. The 2 residents Pierce had tried to silence attended her swearing-in ceremony. Both worked in her department now. Rodriguez, the Marine veteran from IT, had transferred to the VA Security Division, and he'd made sure the hospital's backup protocols were even more robust. Katie's first patient came in at 08 for 7 hours, multi-vehicle accident, 2 veterans critical, 1 with severe abdominal trauma requiring emergency intervention. She moved toward the trauma bay with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her voice cutting through the chaos with single-word commands that people obeyed immediately. Suction. Pressure. Type and cross, 2 units. They didn't call her just a nurse anymore. They called her captain. They called her director. They called her Valkyrie in the spaces where whispers were allowed, in the spaces where people who'd served understood that some names carry more weight than others. Admiral Brennan had sent a handwritten note, displayed on her desk in a frame, "Valkyrie, you saved me twice. Once in Kandahar, once in San Antonio. The Corps doesn't forget." Katie stood at her office window that evening, looking out at the veterans arriving for treatment, her prosthetic legs steady beneath her, her hands finally allowed to do the work they were trained for. She thought about the diner at 3 a.m. The cold coffee. The reflection of someone who'd disappeared. She's not hiding anymore. She exists. She's visible. She's exactly what she always was, a warrior, a healer, a woman with a name that finally belongs to her. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If Katie's story resonates with you, if you know someone carrying a secret they were told to keep, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please share this video. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever watched someone's true identity change everything in a room? We want to hear your stories.